tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So we're continuing the look at wise or right view, sammādiṭṭhi, first link of the Noble Eightfold Path, and the topic was brought up about this somewhat obscure list, or less common than some of the ones we usually talk about, the list of the fetters, the 10 fetters. The Pali term is saṅyojana, S-A-M with a dot, Y-O-J-A-N-A, saṅyojana. And they're a list that it's in the canon. They are emphasized somewhat in the early system. They get a little bit expanded in the later systems, and it's one of the lists that's used to define the 4 levels or stages of awakening, which are stream entry, and then once return, and then non-return, and then arahantship. So stream entry is sotāpanna, and each of the 4 levels is partly defined by which of these fetters is either completely dissolved or weakened. And so the list of all the fetters is this. The first one is self or personality view. The Pali is sakkāyadiṭṭhi. The second is doubt or skeptical doubt, vicikicchā, which is the 5th of the hindrances. The third is belief that rites and rituals are liberatory. This is sīlabbataparāmāsa. And those 3 are the definition for stream entry. So if you are unbound from those 3 fetters, you are a stream enterer. There's other ways of defining stream entry. This is just one of them. The 4th and 5th are the first 2 classic hindrances. So sense desire, kāmacchanda, and ill will or hatred, vyāpāda. And once return, or the second layer of enlightenment, is defined by the weakening of those 2. Non-return is defined as the full uprooting of those 2, sense desire and ill will. And then the remaining 5 are all uprooted only with full liberation or arahantship. So that last 5 is craving for form, rūparāga, craving for the formless, arūparāga. Those both refer to craving for specific meditative states. And then conceit, sometimes called conceit of self, māna. Restlessness, uddhaccaṁ, which is part of the 4th hindrance. And then finally, ignorance, avijjā. So we'll get into the list further on, but I want to talk about just the first 3, and maybe mostly just the first one, sakkāyadiṭṭhi. So these are, in a certain way, an elaboration of the 3 poisons, greed, hatred, and delusion, and they really flesh out some of the specific ways that we are bound, particularly bound to the cycle of birth and death traditionally, really bound to the patterns that are so painful in this life, the patterns of suffering. And they are particular ways that we can see through the patterns maintained through ignorance, born of ignorance, and cut through to new ways of being, new ways of seeing, new diṭṭhi or right view. So, so the very first of these is sakkāyadiṭṭhi or personality view. And this is the heart of stream entry, this first opening of the Dharma eye, opening to a more liberated state. Right? The other two that are uprooted with stream entry, doubt and belief in rites and rituals. Doubt in terms of stream entry mostly points to doubt in the path. In other words, you've attained stream entry, you've realized that the Dhamma is real, it's true, it works, it's pragmatic, it has worked because you've actually attained something, and so doubt is gone. Like you're in the stream of the Dhamma. So it doesn't refer, all the way to like all the forms of self-doubt, all of the deep kind of neurotic doubt that we can suffer from, because we haven't even gotten to sense desire and ill will and the conceit of self and all that. So there's lots more neuroses to get to deeper in the list. Doubt here at stream entry is really just doubt in the path. And so you've arrived, it's clearly liberating, and you know it's liberating. And so then doubt in the path is uprooted. And the third one, belief in rites and rituals, this in a way is the Buddha's answer to those paths that held that external symbolic action or ritual action, not that it couldn't be effective, but actually that it couldn't be effective for liberation specifically. So it can do other things. Magic totally works. Ritual totally works. It can be healing. It can be transformative. It can be a good communication with the spirit realm. But it doesn't uproot suffering, specifically because suffering is uprooted through seeing. Suffering has to be uprooted through having an insight. And you can have insight during ritual, but the ritual itself cannot magically cause the insight. That's what the Buddha is pointing to here. So he's not trying to say that all of those religious forms that are ritualistic are useless or pointless at all, but simply that this is the thing that distinguishes the Buddha's path of liberative insight from other kinds of mystical practice or ritual practice or spiritual practice or purification practice. So that's Fetters 2 and 3, and we can talk more about them. But mostly I want to talk about sakkāyadiṭṭhi, which is really the first opening of the Dharma eye. And so we were just talking a bit about this core inquiry that we can come to in practice of how do I understand this felt sense of myself as arising, or where does it arise? When you feel like yourself, what is that? What's happening in that moment? And so we looked in the meditation at, 3 channels or aspects of experience, using body, heart, and mind, as we often do, and looked at experience in each of those channels for how do I identify with this? How do I know myself in this channel of experience? So in the body, that's sensations, that's the sense of the body as having a continuity over time. So part of how I understand myself is like, if I'm moving through the world, I actually have movement patterns that I recognize. There's ways that I move my arms that I'm like, oh yeah, this feels like me. I remember when I was in college, my college girlfriend said, listen, I hate to tell you this, but you're embarrassing me when we go out dancing. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she's like, you dance really funny. Don't take that wrong. And I was like, it's okay. But like, what do I dance like? She's like, I don't know, kind of like a spider. And I was like, all right, cool. I won't like feel bad about that. But many, many years later, I was hanging out at a party with some friends that I would that we would rave with a lot, and we did a whole like, we would choose one person from that was present, and they're like, okay, everybody now dance like that person, and so everyone would imitate your dance. And when they came to imitating my dance, a couple of my friends were like, here's Sean dancing, and they did a thing, and I was like, really? Is that what I do? And they're like, it's totally what you do. And And I was like, oh yeah, yeah, totally. I get that. That's what I do. That's me. So like there are all these patterns, and they could be negative things as well. The other day I was a little distracted. I turned a corner too tight. I did that thing where you like cut the doorway too tight and you jam your shoulder or your hip against the doorway. And I'm like, okay, spatial awareness is not so strong in that moment. But there was also a kind of that feeling where you're like, yeah, I always do that. Why do I always do that? So all of those little moments have a kind of bodily self-narrative reference. I know myself as inhabiting a body in a certain way. And of course, there's deeper, subtler ways that we inhabit a body. We inhabit the body that has certain talents, certain skills, certain movement patterns, has a certain kind of sexuality, has a certain kind of dance expression, a certain kind of aesthetic expression, and then we go gray and we don't recognize ourselves. We're like, well, that's not me. Who's that gray person? Like whatever. And so in so many ways, we can find in the bodily life something that feels like myself. And so when we feel that, what's going on? What is that? Sometimes it has a narrative sense, like when I bump into the doorway and I'm like, oh, I always do this, And there's a way that like I string that tiny accident together with a bunch of tiny accidents in the past. And if I really want to get going, I could get all self-blamey about it. Like, lost mindfulness again, I do that. Anytime you're like, yeah, I do that, you're taking a present moment experience, stitching it together with past experiences and making a kind of self out of it. That's what I do, Or I go dancing and I'm doing my funny dancey thing that I do. And I'm like, yeah, here I am doing my dance again. Or I'm attracted to the certain kind of person that I'm always attracted to. And every once in a while, when that happens, I'll see somebody, I'll be like, ooh, that person. And then I'll be like, there you are again, doing the thing you do, being drawn to this kind of person, And in all these ways, like, okay, I see a kind of physical, energetic self sense. And then of course this gets shaken, right? You step on the scale or you look in the mirror or you know, go dancing and you're not quite dancing the way it doesn't feel the way it used to feel. And you're like, oh, I'm getting older, or it doesn't quite feel like myself anymore. And I realized that I identified with myself when I was 30. And then that kind of lasted for a while, but now I can't quite move that way anymore. And it's changing. And so I get a sense of both, myself is changing or it's disorienting because there was an identification with something that turned out to be unstable. So all of this we can find in the physical sense, and of course in any of these layers. So in Buddhism, very often feeling and the cognitive sense are lumped together. So we can kind of look at feeling and thought together under the heading of the chitta, the heart-mind. Very often it's feeling where our sense of self is most solidified or rooted. So we felt into our mood, the energetic tone. When you feel into the feeling field, the field of energy and emotion and presence, very often this is where we locate the self. I think partly this is because feelings or emotions are some of the hardest things to disidentify with. That ends up being, this is partly why the second foundation of mindfulness is Vedana, feeling tone, but it ends up for a lot of folks being one of the most useful things to practice disidentifying with, which is the feeling ecosystem. So to really sense, oh, there's a mood here, there's a feeling, there's anger, or there's fear, or there's delight, or loving, or grieving. These things often feel very core to our sense of who we are. And it can be a beautiful practice to then say, okay, wait, what actually am I sensing right now? This is basic emotion mindfulness, right? Second foundation, third foundation, mind state, state of the heart. What am I sensing right now? And how am I sensing it? So I can say, oh, I'm, you know, I'm upset, I'm anxious, let's say. What is that actually? It's like there's some sensations, there's some vibration, there's some heat, there's some tension maybe. And there's going to be like, oh, maybe there's running thoughts. There's kind of a tension in the cognitive emotional field that I've learned to call anxious. And one of the things we can do is we can name it, which already gives us a little distance from it, but then we can sit back into the one who knows that, or the knowing of it, and notice. And you could even phrase it like, oh, look, the weather system that I call anxiety has come upon the body. Think of the body as the field, and the emotions as a kind of coloring, as a kind of wind or energy that's come through. Rather than saying, I feel anxious and I can feel that in the heart as a vibration or a constriction or something. You can say, oh, look, anxiety is here, and here's how it's affecting the body. Here's how it's here. If we are using this kind of practice to not feel something, like, right, if we're pulling back toward awareness as a way to be like, oh, I'm in the inquiry of who I am, therefore I'm going to just rest in awareness, and I'm just going to notice anxiety or fear or anger as if from a distance, it's not always that useful, right? It's not completely a kind of bypass. Bypass is usually a kind of cognitive, delusion, like I'm in denial of something. I'm not really feeling that. All is one, everything is one. This is just weather passing through. But there's a milder form of that where in a way I'm using awareness practice to not be intimate with a feeling that's present, see it from a little distance, which is a beautiful practice and helpful sometimes. But if I'm defaulting to that, or it feels like I don't want to feel it, therefore I'm sitting back into awareness, then sometimes it's helpful to say like, no, actually, this is dukkha, and it has to be understood. And so you shift maybe from like standing way back in the awareness position into coming into more contact. Like, no, feel this really. And part of the challenge in practicing with sakkāyadiṭṭhi, practicing to see personality view or self view, is that we are encouraged to understand that everything we experience is subject to the delusion of ownership, subject to the delusion of control, the delusion of self, including even that sense of sitting back in awareness. To say, even if you say, I am the awareness that's witnessing everything, that's still a sakkāyadiṭṭhi, actually. And this is a place where the Buddha differs from, like the sages, in the Advaita system, who might default to saying, I am consciousness, I am cosmic consciousness or awareness. That position, in a certain way, is like identifying with the most divine or the most rarefied self. And that helps a great deal if we're trying to get out of constriction. But we can hide out in it also. And we can say, oh, that sort of solves the problem of the I am by just saying I am, cosmic consciousness in a way. You don't want to use that language to avoid the dirt, the muck of actually, dealing with the personality, dealing with the self. And I think the Buddha's inquiry is just as radical as identifying with the infinite divine. In this way, it says that, yeah, I actually don't have access to anything that's beyond myself until I uproot the sense of self. And so, like the personality, the I am, is going to, it's going to conscript or grasp onto or co-opt any experience that we have, And in meditation, often we'll have an experience where we cut through it for a moment, in concentration or in inquiry practice, it's often very disorienting, but we're getting a glimpse of seeing through sakkāyadiṭṭhi, seeing through personality view. When it stabilizes, that constitutes stream entry. And so what is that then? Part of our conversation about the sense of self just now involved there being this core to the sense of self where whatever aspect of my experience I'm identifying with, whether it's a feeling or sensation or some kind of process that feels like me here, that one of the things I'm doing is I'm identifying myself in contrast to others. So this is how I come into, this is basic developmental psychology, but one of the first ways that we understand that we are ourselves is we understand that we're not the other, right? There's a differentiation from the mother, there's a differentiation from the womb, from the kind of merged attachment space. And then there's, the whole developmental process of, loving the other, wanting the other, hating the other, fearing the other, wanting union with the other, wanting sexual union with the other, wanting parental union, and then distance from the other, all the different things that we do. We play out in our relationships endlessly. And so this is partly why in spiritual experience, in meditative experience, in mystical experience, very often this breaking through sakkāyadiṭṭhi comes as a kind of unitive experience of feeling, not separate from others or from everything or from existence itself. Because the sense of being a self in a very deep way is just the sense of being not the other. It's just the sense of there being a boundary between myself and other, which of course is a practical, useful, developmentally appropriate boundary to have. Remember not to fall into the pre-trans fallacy, where you forget that the state of heart, mind, understanding before a differentiation, like in infancy, is the same as the awakened state after the differentiation is resolved. So enlightened beings are not like infants who have never experienced the self. There's the awareness of what it's like to feel not separate from anything, but it's a mature knowing that has come through or has moved through the neurosis of the separate self into, a different way of being in the world that's completely different from being an infant, actually, right? That some folks will say, in a way that's the journey that the self needs to take, which is it needs to understand separation, which also means loss, which also means love, all of the things that happen in the relational tension. It has to understand all of that, right, in order to come through the other side and set it down. In a way, what is grasping, tanha, this kind of thirst that is the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, what is that other than in part a feeling arising from half of the self-other dyad toward the other, right? I want the other. I want something that's not myself. Or I want a state I'm unfamiliar with. I want to feel more peaceful or happy or whatever it is, loved. And all of these are relational desires. Tanha is a craving for something in the other, in the external world, to be a certain way. And so part of the resolution of suffering, which is why this is part of stream entry, part of that resolution is the uprooting of the false idea that self and other are defined in this way, defined in opposition, defined as eros, defined as in a kind of tension. And part of what's beautiful in the dissolving of sakkāyadiṭṭhi is not that it ends the sense of relationality. Clearly, it's possible to, open to the Dhamma and still have friends, still have lovers, still be in relationships with others that are deep and rewarding and complex. And it's not like you forget who you are, or somehow lose your boundaries. I think in a certain way, if we use the word eros to speak to the extraordinary power and energy that's possible in the self-other dyad, we can see that eros itself is not defined by grasping. Grasping is a constriction of eros by solidifying into, an orientation toward that which is not. I want something that's not happening. I think eros is the vibrancy of what is happening. And so it's absolutely possible to be in a dynamic, beautiful relationship with the other being the world, the other human, the other entities, anything that seems like not myself, in a way that is not constricted by grasping. So I think part of what happens here is we separate the grasping instinct from the force of connection that we could call eros, or healthy self-other. And what even is the healthy self-other without the grasping in it? I think there's a lot of fear of enlightenment. There's a lot of fear of awakening. And often when folks express that fear, it's fear of the loss of myself, but also the fear of the loss of the beauty of the self-other relationship. I feel like, am I going to lose eros? Am I going to lose sexuality? Am I going to lose love? Am I going to lose appreciation or gratitude or delight in the world? All of which are kind of eros. And it doesn't seem like people do. Like stream entry is not uncommon in the Dharma world. People wake up. It absolutely happens. You may have yourself. We all do in various ways, in stages, over time. Sometimes it feels dramatic. Sometimes it's a gradual maturing, but it totally happens. And it's not the thing that folks are afraid of, which is that we will lose this expression of aliveness that feels so vital and important. But it is the loss of this thing that we have anchored ourselves in for so long, which is the sense of being this one over here, separate from that one over there. And how all of my relationships, all of my projects, and including the project of my sense of myself and what I'm growing into and what I'm doing, all of this is tied into an idea called me that is stitched into my physical experience, my emotional experience, my cognitive felt sense, my sense of being this one moving here in contrast with the other moving there. And so there's a comment here in the chat about emotion and how our language and grammar about emotions can, in a difficult way, encourage where it can be hard to disidentify with emotion, but also in a way that can maintain this sense that the emotion is who I am or where I am, and that in other languages there's other ways of saying it, right? Different from saying I am happy or sad. There's other ways of saying happiness or sadness is in me or is present here. Narrative, of course, lives at least largely in language, along with the felt sense. So you might, just as a basic practice, notice how you talk to yourself about yourself, and how in those words, in those stories, is contained, is threaded through like the unconscious assumptions that we hold about who we are. Right? Notice when you feel like yourself, or when you feel outside of yourself, or far away from yourself, or coming back to yourself. And so our inquiry here, to finish up, is in meditation, get as still as you can. And then into that space, you might just turn toward the felt sense of being me, this felt sense of being yourself, and see what it is you're noticing with that. And often it's just a sense. It's not that easy actually to look at directly. To see what it is you're noticing, if it's a mood or a sensation or a feeling, a felt sense, and just hang out with that. Right? I think it's helpful not to like overlay some doctrine and say, oh, I'm trying to cut through this, but just to feel it and to notice. As we often do in practice, you can use selfing as a verb rather than as a thing. So when you notice your narrative pressing forward, or your preferences coming through, or your personality showing itself, in a meeting or in a conversation, you can notice, oh, selfing is happening, and so that's helpful to just notice it as a process rather than a fixated thing. But the inquiry mostly is to just feel it, to orient to it, and to feel it with a kind of open curiosity. Because what we're looking really for is the ways that it is assumed and therefore not questioned. And so we look at the assumed self, the habitual self, and how it keeps recreating itself, conversation after conversation, situation after situation. And you just feel into it. See, what's here? What is this? And of course, then, in what ways is this suffering? In what ways is this unsatisfying or painful or confusing, or a source of grasping? All right, so pausing there. We'll continue with the fetters. We'll weave this into doubt and rites and rituals maybe next time, and we'll flow into the core hindrances, and look at how the hindrances are also fetters. So they're not just states to suppress or to heal our way through, but they're really aspects of fundamental ignorance or wrong view. And as we go forward, you'll see in a way that everything is just another form of self-view, in a way. Like, it's going to be the same thing again and again. What are the patterns of being and knowing myself that I have habituated in a way that is creating non-freedom? All right, so thanks for your warm attention.